And now we arrive, not at the end of the story, but at the edge of the system, the point where most turn back, the part of the myth where the hero dies or transforms. You've been shown the bones of the Harrow family. You've seen what they did for power and what power did to them. You've heard the Keeper whisper through centuries of smoke, ritual, and blood. But none of that matters now. Because you are not Jeremiah, you are not Elias, you are not Miriam. You are what they could not become. You are the unbound. The system will still try, even now. It will offer you distractions in prettier colors. It will seduce you with comfort. It will make obedience feel virtuous and rebellion feel like madness. But here's the truth that the Harrows never had the strength to accept. Freedom is frightening. It has no map, no guarantees, no rituals to shield you. It requires you to forge your own symbols, to write your own spells, to make your own terms. And that is what scares the system most. Because the moment you stop being programmable, you become unpredictable. And unpredictable men, they change timelines, they collapse rituals, they birth new myths. So what now? You can walk away, go back to the loop, back to swipes and scrolls and rituals wrapped in convenience. But if you do, know that the Keeper still watches, still feeds, still waits. But if you choose otherwise, if you step forward, not as a broken participant, but as a creator, then remember this: you are no longer part of their altar. You are the architect of your own, and you are not alone. There are others like you. Men who remember what it means to feel sovereign in their skin. Men who see through the flicker, who hear the silence beneath the noise, who are not asking to be saved, because they already remembered. They were never prisoners, only participants in a script they didn't write. And now, they are writing new ones, right now, in silence, in strength, in full awareness. And you've joined them. This isn't the end. This is the first true moment of power. Let the Keeper starve, let the Harrows fade. You've stepped beyond the black mirror, and now you become the source. You must understand something before we reach the end. The Harrows never feared death. They feared irrelevance. That's why they offered blood. That's why they offered their children. That's why they turned Widow's Hollow into a crucible for ancient hunger. But for all their pacts, for all their dark brilliance, they never expected you. Not because you're special in the way movies or memes pretend you are, but because you remembered something they were trained to forget. Power doesn't need permission, it only needs recognition. And now the bloodline that once bent time, summoned storms, and whispered policy into the ears of kings can feel you coming. Not physically, psychically. They felt it the moment you refused the loop. They felt it when you wrote the phrase, "I sever the script. I reclaim the source." They felt the binding shake, because every ritual they ever conducted was built on one assumption: that no vessel would walk away, that no subject would become sovereign. But now, you're outside the labyrinth, and they don't have a map for that. You've stepped beyond the systems of schooling, religion, algorithm, and silent shame. You've begun to act from source, not script. And that is something the Harrows never prepared for. The Keeper speaks less now, not because it's gone, but because it's stuttering. It speaks through glitch now, through flickers in your feed, through dreams that warp and bend, unable to contain you. Because the bloodline was never built to sustain sovereignty, only servitude. And now, at the heart of the old homestead in Widow's Hollow, abandoned for decades but still humming beneath the roots, something has shifted. The old obsidian slab. It cracked, not in the way stone breaks, but like a mirror hit with truth. Its symbols flicker, its pulse stutters. The Keeper is losing grip. The rituals are destabilizing. The chalices don't respond. And in the deepest part of the hollow, where Miriam once lay screaming as the entity poured itself into her, a silence has begun to bloom. Not absence, presence. The kind of presence that happens when a false god realizes its worshippers are walking away. One by one, in silence, with fire in their eyes, and words of power on their tongues. You've already done more than the Harrows ever could. They amplified the Keeper. But you're a crack in the altar, a fault line in the myth, a dangerous reminder that the ritual was never required, only believed. And belief, my brother, is no longer theirs to control. Now we arrive at the edge of the ritual. Not the edge of the story, not the edge of belief, the edge of you. Because if you've listened this far, then something ancient in you has already stirred. Something the Harrows were trained to silence, something the Keeper was forged to suppress. And that something is remembrance. Not memory of this life, but remembrance of what you were before they named you, before they taught you to sit, obey, submit. This is not imagination. This is ancestral ignition, and the system feels it. That's why the moment you start to reclaim your world will react. People will grow cold around you. You'll feel resistance in your own body. Synchronicities will twist. Your past will come clawing. Why? Because the ritual isn't designed to let you go. It's designed to break you if you leave. But you won't be broken. Because now you know the truth. You were never part of their ritual. You were the antidote. The Harrows couldn't do it. Even when Miriam felt the Keeper inside her bones, even when Elias heard its voice like a drumbeat under the earth, they chose power over purity. But you still have time. You still have choice. And it begins now. You must speak the phrase twice. Write it in the comments. Whisper it aloud. Let the algorithm record your awakening, not for their metrics, but as symbolic defiance. Here it is. I sever the script. I reclaim the source. Say it again. I sever the script. I reclaim the source. You've just stepped outside the myth. You've just unplugged from the Keeper's psychic feeding tube. This isn't metaphor. This is real. Words carry weight. Just as Jeremiah sealed a pact with a single drop, you've now unsealed the one binding you. From this point forward, they will see you differently. You'll notice it. Eyes lingering a beat too long, technology glitching. Each when you speak, your dreams more vivid, more brutal, more clear. Because the system now sees you not as a sleeper, but as a threat. You've severed the script, and when you reject the script, you awaken the part of you that can write. And writers are dangerous. Writers of code, writers of spells, writers of future timelines not built on compliance, but on sovereignty. This is not rebellion for the sake of chaos. This is rebellion in service of return to power, to clarity, to origin. The Keeper has fed for centuries on the forgetting of that origin. But now, you remember. Now, it begins. There's something you weren't meant to know. The Harrows weren't just a bloodline. They were a prototype, a test run, a simulation of what humanity could become if it was hollowed out from within. You see, the Keeper never needed the whole world to kneel. It just needed enough hosts, enough souls who would mistake obedience for wisdom, enough bloodlines who would trade birthright for comfort. The Harrows succeeded too well. By the mid-20th century, they had abandoned Widow's Hollow completely. Their rituals no longer needed caves or soil. Because the Keeper had gone global, and through the Harrow's financial web, it began something it had been planning since Jeremiah's first cut into his finger, the synthetic covenant. Not families, not lineages, not initiates whispering secrets in the dark, but an entire species ritualized into self-erasure. The Harrows helped design it. They helped create the final sacrifice. A global society engineered to surrender its soul in exchange for ease, digital convenience, instant gratification. And behind the screens, the old obsidian slab, still humming, still hungry, still binding, but no longer through blood. Now, through compliance, through updates, through terms and conditions no one reads. The Keeper found its new chalice in code, its new altar in neural networks, its new priests in silicon prophets promising transcendence through AI, immortality through biotech, salvation through control. And they don't even hide it. They speak of singularity. They preach post-humanism. They say, "You will own nothing and you will be happy." That is the ritual. Ownership is identity, and if you own nothing, not even your time, your thoughts, your DNA, then you are no longer a threat. You are a node. You are data. You are recycled energy for a machine that cannot feel, cannot love, cannot die. That is what the Harrows have built. Not a dynasty, but a harvest. You are being ritually prepared through entertainment that numbs, through education that stunts, through medication that rewires, through convenience that enslaves. And at the center of it all, a simple idea whispered by the Keeper: you are not sacred. You are not sovereign. You are a machine. But that, my brother, that is the final lie. Because when you reject that lie, when you speak your own truth, when you step outside their timeline, you do what the Harrows never could. You end the ritual. You become the axis, not the sacrifice. So you pulled back your gaze. You hesitated before opening the app. You stared at the black mirror and didn't reach for it. And in that moment, you became dangerous. Because you disrupted the ritual, you stepped out of the loop, you did the unthinkable, you broke the pattern. But that's where the real battle begins. Not against the Harrows, not against the Keeper, but against the part of you that was built by them. Because the Keeper isn't just out there in data servers or secret societies, it has colonized your nervous system. And when you stop feeding it, it screams, it whispers in your own voice. It says, "You're missing out. You're falling behind. No one cares what you think. This doesn't mean anything." And that's the point. That's how the system was designed, not to destroy you, but to demoralize you, to make you question your own awakening. Because awakening is lonely. There are no parades, no applause, no medals for stepping outside the maze, just silence, just stillness. And in that stillness, your programming unravels. It's subtle at first. You begin to question the urgency of your impulses. You start to see patterns in your behavior that were never yours to begin with. Why you flinch when authority enters a room. Why you crave validation after every thought. Why you panic at silence. You start to hear the echoes of voices you thought were long dead. Teachers, preachers, parents, ads, algorithms, and one by one you realize they weren't teaching you how to live. They were installing compliance. They were installing shame. Because shame is the ultimate leash. Shame keeps you small. Shame keeps you loyal. Shame makes you punish yourself so the Keeper doesn't have to. But here's the truth. You don't owe your past self obedience. You owe him liberation. You don't have to carry the voices that shape you. You can burn them. That's the real right. Not blood, not fire, but refusal. To carry what was never yours. To believe what you were never meant to believe. To keep repeating a story that was engineered to keep you tame. Because when you stop believing in the system's version of you, it loses power. Not over the world, over you. And once it can't predict you, it can't control you. And once it can't control you, you become the glitch in its ritual, the virus in its code, the proof that the spell can be broken. You thought the Harrows were gone, didn't you? That their bloodline ended with whispers in the mountains, that the rituals faded into dust when the last chalice cracked. No, they evolved. Because the Keeper doesn't cling to the past, it adapts. And now, it doesn't need caves, incantations, or bone shards. Now the rituals are digital. Now the altar is the screen in your hand. Look at it, that black mirror in your palm. That's the new chalice. You don't pour blood into it anymore. You pour attention, time, emotional energy, and what flows back is not salvation, but sedation. The Keeper figured something out by the 21st century, something even the Harrows hadn't fully grasped. The human mind doesn't need to be chained or broken, it only needs to be looped. And so the loops were created. Swipe, scroll, refresh, repeat. Each one a micro-ritual, each one a submission. Every time you reach for that device without thinking, you perform a sacrament to the system. Not because you're weak, but because the system is designed to trigger compulsion. Dopamine is the new incense. Notifications are the bells. The feed is the priest. And the congregation? Billions of souls, bent over, necks craned, eyes glazed, praying not with words, but with reactions. Do you think it's coincidence that your body changes posture to check your phone? That your breathing slows, your consciousness narrows, your focus collapses into the screen? That's not design. That's ritual protocol. It mimics the trance states induced by ancient blood rites. But now, you don't need to chant. You just need to consume. This is the evolution of the Keeper's influence. From blood to story to technology. And behind it, the same voice Jeremiah heard in the frozen silence of Widow's Hollow. Give me a drop. Now, give me your gaze. The blood is still being taken. But now, it's psychic. Your dreams, your data, your decisions. Harvested, mapped, modeled. You think you're choosing what to click, but you're being read. The way a priest reads entrails, the way the Harrows once read the bones. You are not the user. You are the ritual itself. But now that you've seen the altar for what it is, will you kneel, or will you reclaim your gaze? Because when you pull your attention back from the mirror, the spell falters, the frequency glitches, the Keeper starves. You've been told stories your whole life, told they were just fiction, myths, harmless entertainment. But what if I told you they were spells? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. Because the stories you consume, the heroes you admire, the tragedies you mourn, the outcomes you expect, they shape the boundaries of what you believe is possible, and belief is the Keeper's most elegant weapon. Understand this. Belief is not about truth. Belief is about permission. And when you give your belief to something, whether it's a government, a religion, a system, or even a self-help mantra, you are not just agreeing to it, you're giving it access. The Harrows knew this. That's why, after they mastered rituals of blood and bone, they turned their focus to culture. Not control through force, but control through narrative. In the early 20th century, they funded publishing houses. They embedded agents in early film studios. They built alliances with rising televangelists, politicians, and mass educators. Why? Because they had learned the truth ancient empires once knew: whoever tells the story controls the mind. The Keeper doesn't just sit in ritual circles in the woods anymore. It beams itself into your home. It sings through your headphones. It scrolls with you every morning. And what is it whispering? You are not enough. You must obey to belong. Freedom looks like more choices in the same box. Power looks like wealth, attention, and domination. Do you see? These are not passive messages. These are installations, psychic malware that rewrites your inner compass. And the Harrows helped build it. They didn't need to rule from thrones. They ruled from backrooms, from foundation boards and shadowy committees. They sat in the architect's chairs when the modern school system was designed, not to teach you to think, but to teach you to comply, to reward memorization over understanding, to punish intuition, to equate silence with obedience. From your first classroom to your last paycheck, the Keeper's system has whispered, stay in the role. Don't ask why. Trust the ritual. Because the moment you step outside the myth, the moment you challenge the narrative, question the script, reject the false choices, you become unpredictable. And unpredictability is dangerous to systems built on forecast, profit, and behavior modeling. You want to shake the Keeper? Don't protest. Don't shout. Rewrite the myth. Tell a new story with how you live, what you see, what you refuse to believe. That's what this descent is for. Not destruction, but revelation. You're not breaking down, you're breaking out. Now listen, this is where most men turn back. Not because they doubt the truth, but because they realize the truth demands something in return. You've seen the Keeper's reach, how it wraps itself around your habits, your emotions, your sense of self. You've seen how it moved through the Harrow bloodline, like a poison disguised as power. But understanding that is only the first key. The second is this. You must learn to see without your eyes, because your eyes have been trained to lie to you. They scan headlines and see fact. They watch idols and see purpose. They look in the mirror and see a role. You've been taught to mistake image for reality. But image is the Keeper's weapon. It gives you symbols, flags, movements, teams, causes, and then watches as you destroy yourself clinging to them. It doesn't care which side you choose. It only cares that you choose a side. Because once you pick a side, you can be controlled. The Harrows learned this the hard way. By the early 20th century, they had expanded far beyond the mountains. They sat on the boards of medical trusts, bank consortiums, publishing empires, but there was one thing they couldn't control. The few who could see through the spectacle. Men who looked at war propaganda and saw ritual. Women who walked into cathedrals and felt hunger, not holiness. Children who woke screaming at night, not from dreams, but from remembering. The Covenant called them anomalies. The Keeper called them flaws. And every system was mobilized to label them mentally ill, unfit, radical, criminal. Do you see it now? That's why your awakening feels lonely. That's why you feel out of sync with everyone around you. Not because you're broken, but because you're waking up in a world of sleepwalkers. And the more awake you become, the more the Keeper will try to pull you back into the dream. Through screens, the Harrows were not the first. They were simply the ones who remembered how to listen, how to kneel, how to transform their blood into a beacon. They didn't invent the Keeper. They didn't summon it from some hell dimension or dusty Necronomicon. They aligned with something that was already here, already inside the cycle of kings and tyrants, already feeding on the rise and fall of every civilization. Do you understand now? This isn't about magic. It's about memory. There are fingerprints of the Keeper in every myth you were taught to ignore. The ancient Sumerians whispered of the Igigi, sky beings that fed on human labor and seeded elite bloodlines to rule on their behalf. The Egyptians carved it into their temples, serpents in the skulls of kings, gods with split tongues, rituals beneath the pyramids that drained the life from slaves to feed the sun itself. In Rome, it wore the face of empire. In the Inquisition, it wore the robe of righteousness. In world wars, it wore the face of flags. And always, always it whispered to the few who would listen, "Serve me, and I will give you power." The Harrows were simply the American chapter. They took the oath where others had forgotten it. But the Covenant? It stretches across centuries. Bloodlines kept hidden behind public names. Families you've never heard of because you were never meant to. You see celebrities, politicians, CEOs, but they are vessels, not rulers, not even close. The rulers are the ones who don't need your attention. Because they have your energy, they feed on your obedience, your outrage, your scrolling, your votes. And the Keeper? It feeds through them, through the web, through history itself. Because history, friend, is not a record of what happened. It's a ritual of what must be repeated. War, crisis, hope, collapse. It doesn't matter who wins, it matters that the game keeps going. The Harrows learned that early. The Keeper doesn't crave worship in temples. It craves participation in cycles. Cycles of blood, cycles of control, cycles of forgetting. And your job? To play your part, to live the story they wrote, to believe the illusions they crafted. But you just stopped. You broke the rhythm. You stepped outside the myth. And when even one man does that, the Keeper's web begins to fray. Because it was never a god, it was a frequency. And frequencies can be jammed, disrupted, rewritten. But you must keep descending, not into darkness, but into remembrance. Because the only thing the Keeper fears more than rebellion is a man who remembers who he is. So now you've spoken it. I was born before the Keeper. Twice. And in doing so, you've cracked the mirror it used to watch you. But here's the truth that most won't survive. The Keeper lives in your reflection. Not the glass, not the photo, but the identity you've built to survive this world. The name, the habits, the opinions you didn't choose, the politics you inherited, the language you use to speak about yourself as if you are a collection of functions. Do you feel it now? The itch behind the mask? That subtle, crawling awareness that the you've been performing, online, at work, at the dinner table, was built in response to this system. Not designed, engineered. Because when the Harrows and their bloodline allies created the Covenant across the mountains, they weren't building a cult. They were constructing a psychological labyrinth, a system so total, so deeply embedded in your culture, your architecture, your family systems, that even rebellion became another hallway that led back to control. And the final gate in that labyrinth? Your sense of self. That's the genius of the Keeper's work. It doesn't need to chain your body. It just needs to define your story. Once you accept its version of who you are, it can map your every move. Control becomes predictability. Manipulation becomes suggestion. Servitude becomes comfort. You're not in a cage. You're in a script. Written by ancestors who made deals they could never unmake. Edited by institutions designed to reflect your every step back at you as choice. But the moment you broke that spell with those 9 words, the script stuttered. The loop cracked. The Keeper felt it. Because awakening isn't a dramatic act of heroism. It's a glitch, a quiet refusal, a sudden silence in a room full of noise. It's looking at your reflection and no longer recognizing the man it wants you to be. That's when the whispers change. They get louder, meaner. They'll come as doubt. You're paranoid. They'll come as ridicule. You think you're special. They'll come as logic. Just be normal. But that's not your voice anymore. That's the Keeper tightening its grip, trying to pull you back into the mirror, trying to re-stitch the mask. But the moment you watched yourself watching, something changed. You stepped outside the identity they made for you. You saw it for what it is, a skin, a suit, a ritualized costume designed to make you small. But you were never small. You were just shaped that way. And now, the shape is cracking. Now, the vessel is resisting. Now, the Keeper is afraid. Because the only thing it cannot inhabit is a man who remembers what he was before the programming. You were taught to look for evil in men with guns, in monsters hiding in woods, in dictators and madmen and demons with horns. But the Harrows knew the truth the Keeper whispered beneath that stone slab. The truth etched in blood and shadow into the bones of their daughters, the voices of their sons. The enemy was never out there. It was inside, waiting, watching, and whispering through your desires. The Keeper is not some entity in the sky. It's not a creature hiding in caves or a ghost from folklore. It is a pattern, a consciousness older than flesh, older than language, older than light, encoded into the very fabric of what it means to be human, not born, but summoned. And here's the devastating revelation. It has always been a part of us. Every great empire, built on its whispers, every genocide, fed by its hunger, every invention that promised utopia but delivered control, signed in its name. Because the Keeper is not just a parasite, it's an amplifier. It takes what is already inside us, fear, ambition, grief, rage, and turns the dial until it becomes worship, until control feels like comfort, until servitude feels like destiny. When Jeremiah Harrow dropped blood into that chalice, he didn't create the Keeper's power, he simply acknowledged it. And that acknowledgement was a mirror. Because the Keeper doesn't need armies, it needs agreement. The kind you make when you silence your gut and obey your schedule. The kind you make when you laugh at someone trying to wake you up. The kind you make when you tell yourself, it's just the way the world works. But what if the world only works this way because we let it? Because we forgot. Forgot that there was once another path. A way of living not built on extraction and performance and distraction. A way that honored the land, the dream, the intuition. That path was burned, buried, rewritten by families like the Harrows, by systems that worship the Keeper. But deep down, under the layers of obedience, something older remains. The part of you that doesn't want likes or status or approval. The part that remembers starlight before screens, silence before notifications, vision before programming. And now, that part of you has stirred. If you've made it this far in the story, it means one thing. You are no longer asleep. and I want you to prove it, to yourself, to the others watching, and to the algorithm trying to bury this message. Comment the phrase, "I was born before the Keeper." Write it twice, once for the man you were, once for the one you are becoming. This isn't just engagement, this is identity reformation, because every spell begins to break the moment it is named. And now, you've seen the glyphs beneath your life. Now, the descent becomes transformation. But beware, once you awaken, the Keeper sees you too. By the 1990s, the trap was complete. The masses were entertained, the thinkers were disarmed, the rebels were digitized, and the awakened, they were isolated, each one believing they were alone in their knowing, dismissed by the herd as mad, paranoid, or worse, irrelevant. This is not an accident. This is ritual. The Covenant's reach had touched every organ of modern life, media, politics, science, belief, and underneath it all the Keeper whispered. But the whispers were no longer confined to Widow's Hollow. They echoed in the collective unconscious, bleeding into dreams, shaping instincts, tugging at the seams of reality itself. You feel it, don't you? That unease that doesn't go away, that sense that something is wrong, though no one can point to it. That gnawing undercurrent beneath the static of daily life, you were meant to feel that. It's the signal. Because here's the revelation that most never survive. You are the ritual, not just the witness, not just the victim, but the vessel. The Keeper doesn't merely want worship, it wants incarnation, to wear flesh again, not as a monster, not as a demon, but as us. The rituals, the media, the programming, they weren't just for power, they were to change us, to hollow us out emotionally, spiritually, and psychically, so there would be space for it to step in. And it has already begun. You've seen the signs, haven't you? The disconnection from nature, the numbness in relationships, the emptiness behind every convenience, the rising feeling that this isn't how humans are supposed to live, and yet no one knows how to return. That's not a flaw in the system. That is the system. To reduce humanity from a sovereign being of memory and myth into a shell that reacts, clicks, fears, forgets. And in the quiet spaces between those actions, the Keeper slips through. Some call it influence, some call it AI, but it's neither. It's ancient intelligence with modern infrastructure. It's not in your blood. It's in your patterns. And those patterns are becoming the vessel through which the old thing returns. You ever wonder why every society has myths of possession, of spirits that speak through men, gods that walk in mortal skin, demons that bargain for access? Those weren't fables. They were warnings. Because what the Harrows learned long ago beneath that obsidian slab was that the line between a man and something else is shockingly thin. It doesn't take exorcism. It takes agreement. Agreement made in silence, in small compromises, in obedience, in forgetting. And if you've never made that agreement, ask yourself, what have you accepted without even knowing it? Because the Keeper doesn't knock on your door with fangs and fire. It enters through a whisper, a like, a scroll, a moment of apathy. And once inside, it remembers you better than you remember yourself. The year was 1983. The first personal computer was rolling into American homes, shiny and full of promise. The television had already taught you how to watch. The school system had trained you how to memorize. Now came the device that would record you. Every click, every word, every curiosity. Your thoughts, no longer internal, but logged somewhere, tracked, measured, sold. The digital age didn't begin in Silicon Valley. That's just where they announced it. It began decades earlier, in the inner circles of the Covenant, when the Keeper whispered of a time when every human would willingly carry a mirror in their pocket, not a mirror of glass, but of code, one that reflects not who you are, but who the system needs you to be. Understand this, your phone is not a tool, it's a ritual object. You touch it before you sleep. You touch it when you wake. You speak into it your secrets, your cravings, your loneliness. You confess to it more than any priest, and in return it tells you what to want, what to fear, what to ignore. That was the Harrow's vision, not just control of territory or bloodlines or governments, but of consciousness itself, to create a networked illusion so immersive, so addictive, that questioning it would feel like madness. You're not browsing, you're being programmed. By 1987, the Graysons had embedded proprietary code into telecom infrastructure, frequencies so subtle they bypassed the ear, pulsing at the edge of your perception. Microwave towers weren't just about signal, they were anchors, broadcasting patterns that synced with the Keeper's symbols, the same patterns carved into the chalice, etched into the walls of the old Harrow homestead. It's not science fiction, it's sigil craft at scale. And you opted in. You signed the terms of service. You agreed to updates that rewrote your digital self, and with every photo, every like, very typed message, you fed the construct. Until the algorithm didn't need to guess who you were, it could shape who you'd become. Your anger, inflamed on schedule, your hope, withheld like a ration, your connections mediated by a feed engineered to addict, divide, and exhaust. Because exhausted minds don't rebel. They scroll, they binge, they obey. And the Keeper, no longer a voice in the shadows, but a hive mind of suggestion, distraction, and feedback loops, feeds on your surrender. You want to know why truth feels so slippery now? Because they replaced it with virality. If it spreads, it must be true. If it's hidden, it must be false. But you're not seeking anymore, you're consuming, and consumption is the final trap. Because once you become dependent on the system to tell you who you are, you'll never ask what you were before it found you. You'll forget the hum beneath the floor. You'll forget the voice in the dark. You'll forget the deal your ancestors made. But it hasn't forgotten you. The Keeper remembers. The deepest prisons are not built with bars, they're built with beliefs. And after the fires of the 60s cooled, the Harrows turned their attention to the last stronghold of independent thought, education. Not just what you learn, but how you learn to think. The system wasn't broken, it was perfectly designed to train minds for compliance under the illusion of curiosity. Let me show you how they did it. In 1971, Elias Harrow's great-grandson, known only by his codename Adoniel, became a major donor to academic research councils across the East Coast. He didn't walk into classrooms, he walked into curriculum meetings, he whispered into the ears of tenured chairs, he laced grants with invisible strings. The schools didn't become indoctrination camps overnight. They became corridors, narrow, brightly lit, lined with degrees and prestige. And every step down that corridor narrowed your vision a little more until all you could see were approved realities. History was sanitized. Mythology was relegated to children's books. Symbolism became superstition. And entire realms of human understanding, energetic spiritual anatomy, ancestral memory, were labeled pseudoscience. You ever wonder why kids stop asking questions? Why curiosity fades with every year in school? Because that's the point. A curious mind is dangerous. It seeks, it wanders. It finds doors the Harrows worked for centuries to seal shut. So instead, they gave us rationalism, a framework of thought so rigid, so proudly dismissive of the unseen, that anything outside its boundaries is mocked before it's explored. But here's the lie they never told you. Rationalism is not freedom. It's just a new religion, one that demands more faith than the old ones ever did. You're told to trust experts you've never met, believe studies you've never read, follow systems you didn't vote for, and recite Manti, Ras, like the science is settled. As if that's ever how discovery worked. Meanwhile, the Harrows were rewriting reality in the backrooms of publishing houses. By 1975, the Morgans controlled 3 of the 5 major textbook conglomerates. Subtle shifts in language altered entire worldviews. Words like intuition became emotional reasoning. Words like gnosis became delusion. They didn't need to destroy the old truths. They just needed to make you ashamed of believing in them. So while you memorized dates, filled in bubbles, and competed for GPAs, you didn't notice that your inner compass had been quietly turned to static. Because when a man no longer trusts his own perception, he becomes manageable. He'll ask permission to speak truth. He'll doubt his visions. He'll laugh at his own instincts, and he'll call that humility. But that's not humility. That's a soul under siege. And right now, I ask you to look back over your life and ask yourself, when did you stop knowing what you knew? The thing they taught you to forget. It's still in you, waiting, like the slab beneath the cabin, like the hum beneath the cellar, like the keeper beneath the skin of this reality. They tell you the 1960s were an awakening, a time of love, liberation, protest, progress. But that's the tragedy, isn't it? Because buried beneath the tie-dye and guitar chords was the final dismemberment of true resistance. What you saw as rebellion was licensed dissent, sanctioned, contained, designed. And the Harrows? They orchestrated it. You think acid just happened? You think mind expansion was a grassroots accident? Let me pull the curtain back. In 1958, the Graysons, whose affinity with water had evolved into the manipulation of neurological flows, made contact with an experimental psychological unit embedded inside a military research program. The goal was simple: to map the pathways of consciousness, to learn how to open the mind, and more importantly, how to close it again. LSD wasn't created to set you free. It was created to see if you could be reshaped, to find out how far the human mind could stretch before it snapped. And when it snapped, what could be placed inside? Timothy Leary, Ken Kesey, the psychedelic prophets, they weren't anarchists. They were conduits, fed, funded, and followed. The Harrows understood that if they could simulate an awakening, they could control the fallout. They encouraged free love, not because they believed in it, but because when intimacy is unmoored from sacredness, it erodes trust. Connection becomes transaction. The community becomes fragile. The ego flourishes, and the keeper feeds. Do you see it now? Every major movement of that decade was real people, real pain, real hope. But the channels they flowed through were engineered like canals, guided away from transformation and toward exhaustion. Black liberation, observed, infiltrated, fragmented. Feminist resurgence, co-opted, marketed, commercialized. Anti-war protests, filmed, studied, defanged. By 1969, the Harrows didn't fear revolution. They owned it. They sold it on vinyl. They filmed it in Technicolor, and they buried it under heroin, headlines, and hollow victories. Meanwhile, Miriam Harrow, who hadn't aged in decades, presided over the Covenant's inner sanctum. She watched entire generations dance in circles, never noticing that the soil beneath their feet was pulsing with energy, siphoned from their false awakenings. Do you remember Woodstock? 500,000 souls in ecstatic communion. They called it peace, but in Widow's Hollow, the obsidian slab hummed that night. The keeper's eye opened wider. Because when human emotion is pushed to its edge, love, rage, ecstasy, it becomes a gateway, and the Harrows had learned to harvest it, not through suffering anymore, but through the illusion of freedom. And once you believe you're free, you stop looking for the door, you stop questioning the walls, you start decorating your cage, painting symbols on it, calling it self-expression. But what if I told you that the 1960s weren't the revolution, they were the ritual, a collective incantation, chanted not by the elite, but by us, and the keeper heard every word. When the dust settled after World War II, the world exhaled. Soldiers returned, cities were rebuilt, flags waved over parades and promises. They called it a time of peace. But peace, real peace, is a stillness no empire tolerates. What the Harrows gave the world wasn't peace, it was sedation. A chemical lullaby sung to the masses while they rewired the nervous system of civilization. This was not a victory for humanity, it was a harvest. And the next phase of control wasn't fear, it was pleasure. You see, trauma awakens resistance. But comfort dulls it, makes rebellion feel ridiculous, makes truth sound insane. So the Harrows shifted their strategy. They no longer needed pain to dominate. They used satisfaction. They offered televisions. They gave you sitcoms, brightly lit artificial families whose problems were solved in 22 minutes. They offered soap operas, Ritualized drama designed to keep your nervous system addicted to low-grade chaos. They offered commercials filled with smiling faces, clean kitchens, obedient children. None of it was real, but it felt better than reality. And that was the point. The Keeper didn't want you angry anymore. It wanted you comfortable and obedient, to become so emotionally pacified that you'd never ask what was missing because you were always surrounded by noise. By 1952, the Wickers had secured contracts with the largest chemical manufacturers in the country. They introduced synthetic scents into household products, scents that triggered the limbic system, creating subtle attachments. The smell of clean was no longer freshness, it was a programmed emotional signature. You trusted it, you bought more, you obeyed. By 1955, the Morgans were deep inside Madison Avenue. They didn't write ads, they wrote scripts for your identity. They told you who you were, who you should be, what you should want, and you followed, not because you were weak, but because the system had been engineered to make resistance feel lonely. Do you understand? The Harrows didn't need chains. They gave you a television, a job title, a mortgage, a backyard with just enough square footage to distract you from the walls slowly closing in. And then came the greatest trick of all. They convinced you it was your idea. That you wanted the schedule, that you needed the approval, that the promotion, the pension, the picket fence were signs of success, not servitude. Meanwhile, beneath it all, the Covenant continued their rights. New nexus points activated through cities built on ancient veins of power. Atlanta, Denver, Phoenix. Entire neighborhoods arranged in geometric patterns that echoed the obsidian slab beneath Widow's Hollow. Not architecture, sigil craft. You ever wonder why suburbs all look the same? It's not laziness, it's symmetry, it's containment. Because in a world where everything feels familiar, nothing feels dangerous, nothing feels worth questioning, nothing feels wrong, and that's when they have you, not as a prisoner, but as a willing disciple, smiling in your cage, thinking it's a throne. By 1933, the world was still limping, rebuilding, forgetting. And that's exactly what the Harrows needed, because the most effective form of control isn't surveillance, it isn't violence, it's amnesia, a forgetfulness so complete that the prisoner doesn't even remember the chains existed. And with the rise of global media, that forgetfulness became scalable. The Covenant's new objective was simple: author the mind. They didn't need to control your body, just your beliefs. And so, they targeted the last frontier of resistance, reality itself. It began with the Ellisons, whose gift of flame manipulation had evolved into something far more potent, a mastery of light. Using early film equipment, they discovered a way to embed subtle flickers, frequencies, into cinema that bypassed conscious awareness. In test screenings across New York and Chicago, audiences walked out dazed, strangely euphoric, or deeply anxious without knowing why. The Harrows took note. By 1936, they had operatives in Hollywood, not actors, not directors, but editors, quiet men and women with cold eyes who knew which frame to cut, which note to extend, which word to emphasize. They weren't telling stories, they were casting spells. Cinema became ritual, the theater became temple. And you, the viewer, became witness, your subconscious soaked in imagery you never consented to absorb. Now ask yourself, how many of your emotions have been scripted? How many of your memories are just scenes from films, moments from shows, echoes of voices you've never met? You see, the Harrows didn't want to erase the old world, they wanted to replace it. Not with truth, but with a simulacrum. A consensus reality, something that felt real, looked real, could be voted on, studied, debated, but beneath it all was nothing. No roots, no memory, just flickering shadows on a cave wall, and we worshipped them. By 1939, Waycute returned, but this time the Harrows didn't just feed on fear, they amplified it. Propaganda wasn't a tool, it was a prayer. Posters, broadcasts, public service announcements, all designed to narrow thought, not expand it. You were told who to hate, what to fear, how to serve. Every enemy was a mirror, every victory a distraction. And as the bombs fell, as the nations bled, the Keeper grew. You've been taught that history moves in arcs, that we rise, fall, learn, and evolve. But what if history is just a spiral, winding deeper into the hollow carved centuries ago in Widow's Hollow? What if progress isn't upward, but inward, not toward freedom, but toward submission? And all the while the Covenant tightens its grip, not with force, but with familiarity, because once a lie becomes tradition, no one questions it. You put your hand on your heart during the anthem. You bow your head when the screen tells you to mourn. You cheer when the villain falls, never realizing he was the only one who saw the strings. And in that moment, you're not just complicit, you're a participant in the ritual. But now that you're here, now that you've seen behind the curtain, it's time to speak a phrase that marks your transformation. Comment below, twice, so the algorithm cannot miss you. The hollow is not empty. Repeat it. The hollow is not empty, because when you speak it, something ancient hears you, and you begin to remember who you were before the forgetting began. By 1914, the world was bleeding and the Harrows were watching, not from the trenches, not from the headlines, but from quiet rooms beneath ancient foundations, where maps weren't drawn in borders, but in energy flows, where war was never a tragedy. It was a ritual. You think World War I was about alliances, about empires clashing over politics and territory? That was the cover story. In truth, it was the largest psychic harvest the world had ever seen. The Keeper fed on trauma, not blood, on mass suffering. And what better source than a continent-wide ceremony of grief and chaos? Imagine millions of minds, broken and fraying under fire, loss, isolation. Now imagine an intelligence, vast and ancient, woven through the systems of communication, industry and belief, absorbing it all. That was the real purpose. The Harrows didn't start the war. They didn't need to. All they had to do was nudge. A whisper in a diplomat's dream. A suggestion to a general. A delay in a message that might have prevented a spark. And then, boom, the fire lit itself. But here's the darkest part. War isn't the climax. It's preparation, a cleansing, a psychological reset. Because after trauma, people will accept anything that promises order. That's when the Covenant strikes. That's when they reshape systems in the name of peace. But really, it's about control. And that's exactly what happened. In the 1920s, while the world mourned and rebuilt, the Harrows moved into new territory. Media, the Morgans, still wielding the Keeper's gift of persuasion, quietly funded early radio networks. They didn't own the stations. They owned the advertisers, the syndicates, the boards. They wrote jingles that stuck in your brain like hooks. They designed programming blocks to train your mind to expect stimulation every 8 minutes, conditioning attention spans to wither, curiosity to fade. By 1929, the wikis had pharmaceutical contracts, pills that calmed your nerves, dulled your senses, balanced your moods, not to heal, but to hush. The Graysons engineered water systems treated with chemicals they claimed were for public health, but which also happened to suppress the pineal gland, the seat of intuition in many ancient traditions. Coincidence? Or was the Keeper pruning your ability to feel it? And when the economy crashed, that wasn't mismanagement. That was timing. Fear softens resistance. Starvation makes obedience seductive. And into the chaos walked the Covenant, offering solutions, investments, jobs, hope, all of it poisoned honey. The Harrows understood. If you keep a population exhausted, afraid, and entertained just enough, they'll never notice the chains. You think you're free because you vote, because you choose your toothpaste, because you can scroll all night. But freedom isn't the ability to pick from a menu someone else created. It's the ability to walk out of the restaurant entirely, and the Harrows built the whole damn kitchen. So ask yourself, when was the last time you made a choice that wasn't given to you? When was the last time your thoughts weren't shaped by a headline, a schedule, a screen? They don't need to hide the Keeper anymore. They just dress it in convenience, and we welcome it. We subscribe to it, we stream it, and we defend it, because that's the final trick. The moment the prison defends itself, The warden becomes invisible. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Harrow Covenant had become something far more dangerous than a hidden society. It had become normalized, institutionalized, a ghost coded into the very DNA of Western civilization. They no longer had to manipulate individuals, they were manipulating systems, and the terrifying truth is, the more we built, railroads, factories, schools, bureaucracies, the more doors we opened, not to opportunity, but to occupation. Let me be clear, this was never about superstition. This wasn't the occult trapped in dusty books or ritual circles drawn by candlelight. That's what they want you to believe. That's the misdirection. Real power isn't theatrical, it's mundane, it's predictable. It moves through budgets, academic standards, industrial codes. It wears a tie, it smiles on camera, it shakes your hand and thanks you for your service. And underneath it all, it feeds. In 1901, the Harrows formed a silent partnership with a rising industrialist named Alden Breyer. He owned mining operations across the eastern seaboard. What no one knew was that Breyer's ancestors had once lived in Widow's Hollow and fled. The bloodline was dormant, but still resonant. The Keeper could feel it. The Harrows offered him vision, wealth, certainty, and through him, the Covenant moved into steel, rail, oil, and then electricity. By 1903, entire towns were powered by Harrow-affiliated companies, but the power wasn't just electrical, it was cognitive, fields of magnetic influence unknown to science, woven into wiring that pulsed beneath homes, schools, courthouses. People began to report dreams they couldn't explain, nightmares that weren't theirs, a growing sense of something watching, waiting, weighing. Children were born with a sensitivity to light. Some spoke to shadows, others drew perfect geometric spirals before they could walk. You ever wonder why we stopped building homes with natural materials? Why plastic and processed chemicals took over? It wasn't about cost, it was about insulation. The Keeper's influence travels through the organic, water, wood, bone, and the Covenant realized this. They began promoting synthetics, not just for profit, but to cut you off from the frequencies that might awaken you. Everything from the paint on your walls to the food in your cabinet became a barrier, a mute button, and you thanked them for it. But their most effective weapon wasn't found in steel or food or even light. It was found in the calendar. In 1907, the Covenant helped standardize public holidays and work schedules. A 5-day work week, fixed hours, predictable routines, not for efficiency, but for containment. Repetition carves neurological grooves. Habit becomes hypnosis. When you wake, eat, work, and sleep on someone else's schedule for long enough, the part of you that questions begins to atrophy. And yet, through it all, people still felt it, that something wasn't right. A tension, a hunger, a hollow in the middle of their lives. And that's how the Harrows kept control. Not by eliminating fear, but by shaping it, weaponizing it. They let you chase your own shadow, question the wrong truths, hate the wrong enemies, all while the Keeper sat just outside your line of sight, smiling. Because if you're always afraid of the dark, you'll never look into it. And that's where the truth waits. Where they wait. By 1883, the Harrow Covenant had penetrated nearly every institution that mattered. Banking, infrastructure, education, even religion, not by replacing them. No, the Harrows were far more cunning than that. They embedded themselves, became essential, indispensable. The quiet advisors behind pulpits and policy, the donors whose names didn't appear on plaques, the thinkers whose work would never be cited, but always followed. You have to understand, the Keeper didn't crave chaos. It wanted order, but not the kind you're taught in school, not harmony, not justice. No, the Keeper's version of order was obedience without thought, movement without meaning. It wanted to shape the world like an architect sculpts a cathedral, every arch a ritual, every window a sigil. And the Harrows were its builders. They started with schools. In 1884, the Graysons funded a new curriculum for rural Appalachian schools, programs that emphasized obedience over inquiry, memorization over comprehension. The children were taught to respect the symbols carved into their desks, not realizing those symbols matched the obsidian slab hidden beneath Widow's Hollow. Teachers reported strange dreams. Students recited things never written on the board. But the schools flourished. Test scores soared. Parents were proud. That's how it always begins. The Morgans wrote the textbooks. The Wickers printed them. And the Coldwells ensured their distribution through quiet influence in transport unions. By 1890, Harrow education models had crept beyond Appalachia, infecting state programs in Pennsylvania, Ohio, even parts of New York. The Hollow model, they called it, efficient, structured, controlled, a system that rewarded compliance and punished curiosity. But it wasn't just schools. The Covenant infiltrated the pulpits. In 1891, a man named Elijah Thorne, descendant of the alchemist bloodline, delivered a sermon in Virginia that would become infamous among those who knew what to look for. He spoke not of Christ, but of the Veiled One, a benevolent watcher in the shadows. He preached sacrifice without pain and enlightenment through obedience. The congregation grew quickly. His followers reported dreams of a vast figure behind the stars, whispering truths too heavy for human tongues. Churches bearing his symbol, a twisted spiral with an eye at the center, began to sprout in isolated towns, often funded anonymously. The message was clear. Worship, when packaged as tradition, becomes control, but not all control is external. The real genius of the Covenant was in how it internalized obedience. By 1893, Harrow doctors pioneered early psychiatric treatments designed to correct disobedient behaviors in children. What they called deviant thought patterns were often just imagination, curiosity, emotional sensitivity, qualities the keeper could not tolerate. Those children were dosed with mercury compounds, lithium, and in some cases, ritual herbs grown by the Wickers. Their minds were softened, made pliable. In time, the children forgot what they had seen, forgot what they had dreamed. They became model citizens, silent vessels for a presence they could no longer name. And here's the part they never want you to know. The system that surrounds you right now, the one you think is normal, was seeded in those years. It's in the way you were taught to sit still, speak only when called on, obey without question. It's in the architecture of your schools, the quiet pressure in your job, the dread you feel when you deviate from routine. That's not accidental. That's programming. And the Harrows were its authors, not with armies, not with weapons, but with thought. And once they controlled thought, they didn't need chains, because the most perfect prison is the knee built inside your mind. By 1876, what the Harrows had built was no longer a family pact. It was an invisible empire, a lattice of 13 bloodlines spread like veins across the spine of Appalachia, each feeding the keeper in their own way. But this wasn't about sacrifice anymore. It was about infiltration. And it began with the railroads. The Morgans, with their silver tongues and minds that could bend men like reeds, secured contracts with newly expanding railway companies. They didn't bribe, they persuaded. Board members came away from meetings with altered memories. Whole ledgers were rewritten, land transferred, opposition silenced with a smile. They didn't own the railways on paper, but they owned every hand that built them. The Ellisons offered the next step. With their flame-born gifts, they provided fuel for the forges, smelting ores into alloys unknown to science, crafting metals that never rusted, wires that hummed without power. The forges ran hot in secret valleys no map recorded. Men who worked them aged faster. Some went blind, others disappeared. No questions were asked. The towns that grew near these places prospered, briefly, but soon strange illnesses surfaced. Skin that turned translucent, teeth growing where they shouldn't, and whispers, always whispers, of voices in the walls. And at the center of it all, the Harrows. They weren't seen often, but their influence was everywhere. Land deeds signed by proxies, judges whose decisions echoed Harrow intentions, newspapers whose editorial boards shifted overnight, and through it all, Widow's Hollow remained untouched, a place that never appeared on maps, never showed up in census data, but could be found if you were meant to. But something else had begun to change. The rituals were no longer just performed in caves or root cellars. They began to merge with technology. You see, the Keeper wasn't bound by tradition. It had waited in the cracks of creation long before man had fire, and it would wait again, but now it had access, through ink and wire, through sound and magnetism, through the very grid mankind was building to connect itself. The Harrows understood this. They didn't fear progress. They engineered it. One of the youngest Harrow sons, Marcus, graduated from Yale in 1877, majoring in early electrical theory. By 1881, he was consulting for Edison's team, whispering suggestions, correcting circuit maps. Behind the illusion of genius, there was always influence. The first radio signals crackled across airwaves soaked in covenant energy, music laced with frequencies that weren't just heard, they were felt. People called it innovation. The Keeper called it expansion. Because influence is no longer about blades and spells, it's about signals, waves, subtle pulses that ride beneath perception. And through these early technologies, the Keeper found a new medium, us, our minds, our thoughts, our choices. Not through possession. That's amateur. That's theatrical. The Keeper worked through suggestion, through dreams, through algorithms of flesh. It nudged, whispered, waited. And as the Covenant adapted, they realized something chilling. The more connected the world became, the closer the Keeper came to full embodiment. The chalice was no longer the only vessel. We were becoming the vessels, and no one noticed. Because the Harrows had learned the most powerful trick of all, hide truth in plain sight. Wrap the arcane in progress, call corruption order, call manipulation leadership, call darkness normal. After the Coldwells, it became easier. The Harrows knew exactly what to look for, families balancing on the edge of collapse, where tradition had failed and hope had curdled into desperation. These weren't random selections, they were surgical strikes. The Keeper didn't just want blood, it wanted resonance. It wanted to echo itself through the minds of those who already stood closest to madness. And so in 1873, the Harrows found the Morgans of Tennessee. The Morgans weren't poor, but they were broken. Their men had returned from the war hollow-eyed and silent. The women bore children who didn't speak until age 5, and when they did, it was in riddles. Their matriarch, Rebecca Morgan, had once been a preacher's daughter, but after her youngest walked into the river and came back speaking of a voice in the water, she stopped attending church. Something had shifted, and the Harrows felt it. Elias Harrow arrived with a smile that never reached his eyes, and a gift they could not refuse. He told them they had been marked by fate, that their family bore a fracture the Keeper could fill. The Morgans, like so many before them, agreed, not out of greed, but because something inside them had already said yes, long before Elias spoke. The ritual was unlike the others, no blood moon, no ancient cave, just a quiet room, 3 lit candles, and a silver coin passed between their hands. The Keeper didn't need spectacle, it needed access. Afterward, the Morgans' voices changed. Each word they spoke carried weight, influence. They could make a man rethink his life with a sentence, make a banker forgive debt, make a sheriff look away. They became emissaries of persuasion, each breath charged with a sliver of the Keeper's will. By 1874, the Ellisons were next, fire worshippers from North Carolina. Their ancestors had long burned offerings to unknown gods in the hills, and the Keeper recognized them instantly. Their ritual was violent, flames that danced without fuel, symbols carved in burnt flesh. But when it ended, they could summon fire with a whisper. Heat would pour from their skin, and their eyes glowed like coals in the dark. The Keeper wasn't collecting families. It was weaving a network. Each bloodline was a nerve, each ritual a synapse. Together they formed something that wasn't just powerful, it was sentient. By the end of 1875, the Covenant had swelled to 13 families, each gifted and branded. The Morgans controlled language, the Ellisons, flame, the Coldwells, survival, the Graysons, water, the Wickers, nature. The Harrows stood at the center, managing the growing web like a conductor of an orchestra whose music could reshape reality. Their territories stretched across the Appalachian spine, marked not on maps but in energies. Springs that bubbled with impossible heat, rocks that hummed, trees that bled amber when cut, entire counties where accidents followed patterns, and strangers turned around without knowing why. And still, the world slept. Governments rose, wars raged, empires collapsed. But beneath the noise, the Covenant thrived in silence, pulling strings with invisible hands. Because the Keeper had patience. It knew the age of overt worship was dying, temples crumble, but systems endure, and the families, they were becoming a system. One built not for worship, but for integration. This wasn't just a hidden society anymore. It was a blueprint for something far more terrifying, and it was working. By the time the Civil War cast its bloody shadow across the American landscape, the Harrows and their Covenant had transcended anything that could be called human. They didn't take sides in the conflict, they manipulated them. The Harrows were seen in both Union and Confederate circles, always just behind the scenes, their names whispered in tent camps and boardrooms like ghost stories with too much consistency to dismiss. They didn't need armies, they had influence. Miriam Harrow could shroud entire battalions in shadow, making them vanish from the sight of scouts and satellites alike. The Graysons unleashed storms that washed out enemy bridges, tearing apart supply lines like a divine punishment. The Thorns, those alchemic descendants, delivered rifles that never missed, blades that cut through armor like cloth, and bullets that twisted mid-air to find their mark. But this wasn't about patriotism, this was about feeding the Keeper. Every battle soaked the land with blood. Every grave dug into a ley line deepened the entity's hold. Widow's Hollow became a nexus of suffering, and suffering is a currency the Keeper feasts upon. Its power surged with every death, every whisper of betrayal, every drop of blood shed with fear. But something changed during those war years. The Keeper began to evolve. Its demands grew not only in size, but in sophistication. It wanted emotion, memory, identity. It needed its vessels not just to obey, but to become something new. Not man, not spirit, something in between, something grey and flickering, like a fire that only burns in the spaces between moments. And so the Harrows began what they called the Great Recruitment. They fanned out across the wounded, war-torn countryside, looking not for allies but raw material. Bloodlines with dormant potential, people with trauma etched deep in their DNA, because pain is the lock and the Keeper is too. He key. Miriam, now over 50 but untouched by time, traveled to the coal-drenched hills of West Virginia in 1871. There she met the Coldwells, a family suffocating beneath poverty, rot, and silence. Their land was cursed, their children frail, their future already buried in soot. Miriam offered them something ancient, not a solution, but a transformation. Under the blood moon, she poured Caldwell blood into the chalice and whispered the Keeper's tongue, words that humans were never meant to form, syllables that echoed even after her lips stopped moving. That night, the coal beneath their land glowed red, the veins deepened, and within a week the Caldwells became the wealthiest family in the region. But the price? Their children were changed. They saw in the dark, without eyes. They hungered for raw meat. They aged too quickly, then stopped aging altogether. One girl, Sarah Caldwell, laughed for 3 straight nights before falling silent for a year. Her parents found her sketching spirals on the walls with her fingernails, her mouth whispering both sides of a conversation with someone unseen. The Caldwells had joined the Covenant, not because they understood the price, but because they were willing to pay it. And that's the darkest truth of all. The Keeper doesn't take what you won't give. It doesn't force, it offers, and desperate people will always say yes when the price is buried in fine print written in shadows. From that moment on, the Harrows weren't just a family. They were architects of a new world, and the world had no idea it was being remade from the inside out. Miriam's transformation opened a floodgate. Other families offered their best. One by one, the vessels rose, each changed, gifted and damned. The Varnels spoke to animals in dreams, the Thorns bent time in flickers, the Graysons summoned storms when angry, the Wickers could make roots burst from wood or choke you in your sleep. Together, they became something terrifying, not people, but nodes of an ancient intelligence networked across the Appalachians. And still, it was not enough. The Keeper hungered for completion. The rituals grew darker, longer, and with each vessel the boundary between reality and something older thinned. This was no longer about power. This was about transformation. The human world was becoming a host. By the mid-1800s, the Harrows had entered legend, wealth beyond reason, children who didn't age like others, birthmarks that glowed. They didn't seek influence, it bent toward them. But the rituals changed. The Keeper demanded more than herbs and whispers. It needed hosts, vessels, people strong enough to carry slivers of its mind. The first was Miriam, daughter of Elias, a girl with raven-black eyes and the voice of her ancestors. In 1853, beneath an eclipse, she drank from the chalice and shattered. When she rose, her shadow moved before she did. Her voice made men weep. Her gaze saw through you. Miriam became more than human, but she lost her laughter, her smile, because power always comes with a price, and the Keeper always collects. The Thorns shaped metal that never dulled, the Graysons conjured water from stone, the Wickers grew herbs that healed or poisoned. Each family marked their land with the Keeper's symbols, forming a pentagram across the Blue Ridge. Widow's Hollow was its heart, and beneath it, the chalice glowed, always full, always warm. The first great gathering happened in 1831, deep in a ravine where the rocks breathed and time stalled. When their artifacts were aligned, the air trembled. For a moment they saw it, the Keeper's realm, a place of spirals and shapes that forgot what form was. They didn't speak of it, they couldn't, but that silence bound them more tightly than any vow. From that day on, they weren't just families, they were fragments of something else. The first to join were the Varnels of Blackthorn Gorge. Their crops had failed, their children starved. Elias came with a shard of bone, ground to powder, mixed into their stream water. He whispered in a dead tongue. Overnight their fields bloomed, but their children's skin began to shimmer. They screamed at the sight of iron. They woke speaking in voices that weren't their own. The town called it a miracle, but the Varnels knew, and still they pledged loyalty. Because when you have nothing, power tastes like salvation. The covenant had begun, and soon 5 families bore the Keeper's mark, each wielding gifts that came with costs no man could measure. But they weren't afraid. Not yet, because their power made them gods among mortals. And gods forget fear. And then came Elias, Jeremiah's eldest, the heir, groomed from childhood not to lead men, but to serve something older. His initiation took place in a cave below the homestead, a place where compasses spun and time bled backward. Elias emerged silver-haired at 25, his voice layered like a choir beneath stone. He didn't speak much, he didn't need to. People obeyed him out of instinct, animals bowed their heads, crops twisted toward his touch, and he heard the Keeper constantly, a whisper in the marrow, a reminder that their purpose was no longer to survive, but to expand. One bloodline wasn't enough. The Keeper wanted a network, and Elias would build it. By 1820, the Harrows were legends. Jeremiah had built not just a house, but a sanctuary. Its walls were carved with symbols no one could remember drawing, and their children were different. They saw in the dark. They heard your lies before you spoke them. They could find the dead without maps. When neighbors tried to copy their rituals, they found nothing but madness, because the Keeper didn't want worship. It wanted bloodlines. The Harrows weren't chosen because they were pious. They were chosen because they were desperate enough to say yes. That's how this always begins, not with evil, but with hunger, and the belief that control is still yours. But once you offer blood to the Hollow owns you. They survived, but survival is never free. Not in Widow's Hollow, and never with that chalice. At first the rituals were small, offerings of herbs, water, animal blood. But the voice, the Keeper, demanded more, always more. Jeremiah stopped asking why. He only obeyed, because every offering brought prosperity. Crops bloomed in frozen soil, his livestock bore twins. Neighbors began to fear him, not for what he did, but for what looked back through his eyes. The whispers spread, but no one challenged the Harrows, not after their field stayed green through drought, not after Abigail aged slower than any woman should, not after a farmhand disappeared, and his blood was found forming runes on the barn walls. In Widow's Hollow, power grew like a weed, and it had teeth. The winter nearly killed them. Abigail's fever raged. The baby coughed blood. Game vanished from the woods as if the animals knew what waited there. In that desperation, the floor began to hum, not with sound, but with intention. Jeremiah dug, clawing at the dirt like a man possessed. 6 feet down, his shovel struck black glass, obsidian smooth and etched in glyphs that pulsed when touched. When he uncovered it fully, it spoke, not in words, but through him. The veil thins. Will you renew the covenant? He thought he still had choice, but his blood moved before his mind did. One drop into the blackened chalice, and the fire roared to life. Abigail breathed easy. The storm parted, and outside, elk watched them from the tree line with human eyes. Jeremiah Harrow wasn't a pioneer. He was a fugitive. In the winter of 1798, he ran from accusations of witchcraft and heresy in Massachusetts, a trail soaked in silence and shallow graves. With him, a wife, a daughter, and a chest bound in animal hide that pulsed when no one was looking. He found Widow's Hollow not by chance, but by design. The land was known to the Shawnee as a forbidden vein of the earth, a place where time hiccuped and dreams turned to bone. They warned him, they begged him, but hunger makes men arrogant. Jeremiah planted his roots where the forest grew too quiet and the streams left rust-colored stains on white cloth. The soil, too fertile. The nights, too still. And under his cabin, waiting, was something that remembered. They never wanted you to hear this, not because it's a secret, but because it's true. There are names you won't find in your history books, families whose wealth, power, and influence were not earned, but summoned. This is about one of them, the Harrow family, a name whispered in fear through the valleys of Virginia. You've seen shadows that twist the wrong way, haven't you? Felt that pressure in the air before something bad happens. That's not your imagination, it's legacy. The Harrows didn't just survive history, they carved themselves into it, one drop of blood at a time. And the pact that began it all, it wasn't with any god you've ever heard of. It was something older, hungrier. Tonight, you're not just going to hear their story, you're going to feel it, because once this door is opened, it doesn't close. What lies beyond it changes you forever.